Welcome to a Miss Marple Mystery, where every teacup hides a secret, every glance conceals a motive, and only one woman sees the truth behind the lace curtains of Mildred's. A quiet English village, a glittering garden party, and a deadly secret hidden among pearls stay till the end, because Miss Marple is about to uncover a murder no one saw coming. I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where are you listening from today? How are you feeling? What's happening in your part of the world right now? I'd really love to know. The May morning broke with such gentle sunlight that the entire village of Mildred's seemed to have awakened in unusually good spirits. The church bells had just finished their cheerful ringing when the villagers began drifting toward Fairfax Hall, where Lady Constance Fairfax was hosting her annual garden luncheon, a tradition as firmly rooted as the ivy climbing her Georgian facade. The Fairfax estate, sprawling yet elegant, had been in the family for generations. The lawns rolled gently toward the ornamental pond, beyond which stood rows of rose bushes in extravagant bloom. White marquees fluttered like sails in the mild breeze, and the scent of hydrangeas mingled with the aroma of freshly baked scones and cucumber sandwiches. It was an event not to be missed, even for those who found Lady Fairfax's hospitality somewhat selective. Among the guests that day was Miss Jane Marple of Mary Mead, invited through the good graces of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, who declared that a little change of air and society would do dear Jane a world of good. Miss Marple, dressed in soft grey and carrying her small parasol, arrived promptly at 12:30, looking as unassuming as ever, a delicate figure with shrewd blue eyes that noticed everything and revealed nothing. Lady Fairfax, a woman of formidable bearing and tastefully concealed age, was in her element. She wore a string of magnificent pearls that glowed with an almost otherworldly luster, each orb flawless and heavy with history. They were her pride, her signature, the Fairfax pearls, as everyone called them. Their origin was rumored to involve a scandalous romance in Bombay during the Empire days, though Lady Fairfax never confirmed such gossip. "Oh, my dear," she said grandly, greeting Miss Marple with a perfumed hand. "How perfectly delightful to have you. We must find you a seat in the shade. These southern rays are positively brutal." Miss Marple smiled, inclining her head. "You are very kind, Lady Fairfax. I dare say I shall survive the sunshine." By 1 o'clock, the garden hummed with polite chatter, laughter, and the tinkle of teacups. The villagers mingled with Lady Fairfax's more distinguished guests, the retired Colonel Lacey and his waspish wife, Dr. Edmund Craythorne, the local physician known for his discretion and fondness for sherry, young Iris Pembroke, Lady Fairfax's companion and secretary, quiet and pale, with eyes that rarely met anyone's, and Mr. Lionel Greaves, a handsome man of uncertain employment who had recently returned from business abroad. There were others, of course, Mrs. Weatherby fluttering about in motherly excitement, the talkative grocer's wife, Mrs. Finch, and the Reverend himself, who tried to maintain a conversation about parish repairs while Lady Fairfax steered him toward the pate. Miss Marple observed it all with the mild interest of one who enjoyed studying the small, telling details of human nature. She noted how Iris flinched slightly when Lady Fairfax spoke sharply to her, how Mr. Greaves's gaze lingered a moment too long on the pearls, and how Colonel Lacey's wife sniffed with disapproval each time sherry was poured. It was during the toast, a brief and boastful speech by Lady Fairfax in praise of continuity, tradition, and English grace, that the first shadow passed across the day. As the guests raised their glasses, Lady Fairfax suddenly faltered. Her hand trembled, the champagne flute slipped from her fingers, striking the table with a chime that silenced the laughter. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Then, with dreadful slowness, she collapsed onto the lawn, her pearls scattering like drops of moonlight. The scene dissolved into chaos. "Mrs. Weatherby screamed. The Reverend dropped his napkin and rushed forward. Dr. Craythorne knelt at once, checking for pulse and breath. She's gone," he said grimly after a moment. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done." No one moved for several seconds. Only the wind stirred the tablecloths, carrying the faint scent of lilac and the shimmer of the fallen pearls. Miss Marple, very still, looked from the doctor to the pearls, then to the champagne flute lying in the grass. It was Iris who broke down first, sobbing into her handkerchief. Mr. Greaves stood nearby, pale but composed, muttering something about a weak heart. Colonel Lacey demanded that someone fetch the constable at once. When Inspector Mallory arrived, a brisk, competent man with a pencil moustache and the calm authority of someone used to village emergencies, he quickly took control of the scene. The guests were gathered in the drawing room, and the remains of the luncheon were cordoned off. "She was in excellent health," said Dr. Craythorne. "I examined her not 3 months ago. No sign of heart trouble then." "Poison?" someone whispered. Inspector Mallory looked uncomfortable. "Far too early to say." Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair near the window, her knitting basket unopened beside her. She did not speak, but her eyes followed the young maid who was clearing the tea service, a nervous girl named Bessie who avoided everyone's gaze. The inspector questioned each guest, but the accounts were vague and overlapping. No one had seen anything unusual. No one except, perhaps, Miss Marple. She rose gently when the inspector paused near her. "If I might make a small observation, Inspector," she said, her tone mild. "It did seem to me that Lady Fairfax touched her pearls just before she fell. A curious little gesture, as though they pained her." The inspector frowned. "Her pearls?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I dare say it's nothing, of course. But it reminded me rather of poor Mrs. Penhaligon, who suffered from an unfortunate habit of handling her necklace after dusting it with something quite unsuited for human contact." There was a murmur among the guests. Dr. Craythorne's brows knitted together. "You think the pearls themselves?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her eyes calm and bright, "that one must always consider the simplest possibilities first, especially when vanity and malice walk hand in hand." Outside, the church bells began to toll for the evening service, and in the great house of Fairfax Hall, the glittering pearls lay upon the table, silent, deadly, and waiting to tell their tale. The morning after Lady Fairfax's sudden death dawned pale and uneasy over Mildred's. The villagers, who only yesterday had laughed beneath silk awnings and sipped champagne, now spoke in low tones over garden fences and shop counters. The talk was everywhere, at the post office, at Mrs. Finch's grocery, even whispered outside the church after morning prayers. The grand lady of Fairfax Hall was dead, and some said poisoned. But by whom, and how, were questions tangled thick as ivy. Miss Marple, after a restless night at Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, sat quietly with her tea and toast, reading the local paper that devoted a brief column to the tragedy. No official cause was stated, though the editor hinted foul play is suspected. Miss Marple's eyes lingered over that phrase. She had seen such careful language before, the mark of an investigation still groping in the dark. Inspector Mallory, meanwhile, was at Fairfax Hall again, interviewing the servants. The pearls had been taken for analysis, though no report had yet returned from the county laboratory. The inspector had asked that no one leave the village until further notice, and that alone was enough to turn Mildred's into a simmering kettle of speculation. By late afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby insisted on visiting Iris Pembroke, the late lady's companion, just to see the poor dear wasn't alone. Miss Marple agreed to accompany her, knowing such visits often revealed more than polite intention. They found Iris pale and anxious. Sitting in the drawing-room where the tragedy had unfolded, the drapes were half-drawn, casting the room in a muted light. The pearls, of course, were gone. Only the faint impression of their case remained on the mantel. "I cannot make sense of it," Iris murmured, twisting a handkerchief in her fingers. She was so full of life. "We were planning the summer fete only 2 days ago." Mrs. Weatherby offered kind words, but Miss Marple's gaze was elsewhere on the sideboard, where several empty bottles stood neatly arranged. She noticed one still half full of mineral water. its stopper slightly misaligned. "You must be very busy, Miss Pembroke," she said gently. "So many guests yesterday, and all those glasses to wash afterward." Iris hesitated. "Yes, though Bessie helped me with most of it." Poor girl was terribly shaken. "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Bessie, the maid who served the champagne?" Iris nodded. "Lady Fairfax insisted on her doing it, said the girl had a steadier hand than the butler." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "A steady hand is always a virtue. But sometimes a trembling one reveals far more." When they left the hall, the air outside was thick with lilac and unease. Mrs. Weatherby prattled on about grief and propriety. But Miss Marple remained silent, her mind turning over each detail. The pearls, the champagne, the maid's trembling fingers, the slight stain on the lace tablecloth that no one had bothered to mention. That evening, at the vicarage, the inspector called upon Miss Marple, ostensibly to inquire whether she had noticed anything out of the ordinary. He was beginning to see that the old lady's observations often cut straighter than his own methods. "I cannot prove it yet," she told him mildly. "But I do believe Lady Fairfax's death began long before that luncheon. You see, people don't die of poison by chance. They die of someone's patience." Mallory frowned. "You think it was deliberate, then? Not an accident?" Miss Marple looked into the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. "And I think the hand that poured the champagne may not have known it carried death." Outside, the evening wind rustled through the ivy of Fairfax Hall, whispering of secrets not yet unearthed. The following morning, Miss Marple rose early, stirred not by sleep but by the troubling clarity of a pattern forming in her mind, faint still, but undeniably there. She sat by her window in Mrs. Weatherby's guest room, looking out across the dew-silvered garden while sipping a strong cup of tea. Her thoughts circled back to Iris Pembroke's thinly veiled anxiety, the half-sealed bottle on the sideboard, and the tremor in Bessie's hands. It wasn't merely grief that gripped the household, it was fear. Fear always lingered a shade deeper in the voice, just beneath the surface of grief. She knew the difference. By mid-morning, word reached the village that the preliminary laboratory report had arrived. A trace of thallium, a quiet, cruel poison, had been detected on the pearls. Not in the champagne, as many had suspected, but on the necklace itself. Miss Marple received the news from Dr. Craythorne, who visited the vicarage, looking unusually pale beneath his neatly trimmed moustache. "Thallium," he said with a slow exhale. "Insidious stuff. Odorless, tasteless. It's absorbed through the skin, you know. A poison that waits." Miss Marple only nodded. The memory of Lady Fairfax's hand, briefly clutching her pearls before collapsing, came back with eerie precision. A gesture of discomfort, yes, but also, quite possibly, the final contact. "It was recent contact," Dr. Craythorne continued, almost to himself. "She must have worn them before the poison had time to dissipate. Someone applied it that morning, or the night before." That detail brought everything into sharper focus. The pearls had been displayed in the study the day before the luncheon, locked in their velvet case, a treasured relic rarely handled unless Lady Fairfax intended to wear them, which she had announced, with some pride, she would. Miss Marple's mind wandered to who might have had access to that case in the hours leading up to the luncheon. Iris, of course. Bessie, perhaps. But there was also Lionel Greaves, the recently returned businessman, whose vague references to colonial ventures had not fooled Miss Marple for a moment. And hadn't she seen his gaze flicker just briefly toward the pearls more than once during the luncheon? That afternoon, Miss Marple found a reason to stop by the Fairfax Hall once again, under the pretext of returning a borrowed shawl. Iris answered the door, her expression drawn and distracted. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said gently. "I happened to find this among Mrs. Weatherby's things. I believe Lady Fairfax loaned it to her during the garden party." Iris took the shawl with trembling fingers. "Thank you. Everything feels so strange now, like the house is holding its breath." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. I know that feeling. Houses remember things. I believe especially old ones. May I ask, my dear, who would normally clean or prepare Lady Fairfax's jewellery? Iris blinked. Well, she never trusted the servants with them. I usually wiped them down before she wore them, just with a dry cloth, nothing more. And on the morning of the party, I took them out early, just after breakfast. Set them out on the dressing table. She always liked to admire them before choosing her outfit. Then I went down to arrange the seating. I didn't touch them again. Miss Marple made no comment, only offered a soft thank you and turned to leave. But just before stepping through the doorway, she paused. Oh, one last thing. You mentioned earlier that Bessie helped serve drinks. But tell me, was she in the dressing room that morning as well? Iris looked confused. I don't think so. She was busy preparing the marquise. Why? Miss Marple smiled faintly. No reason. Just tying up little threads. You know how easily they fray if ignored. As she walked back to the vicarage, the early summer sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light upon the path. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her thoughts increasingly certain. The poisoning of the pearls had been no impulsive act. It required access, planning, and a level of knowledge that eliminated nearly everyone. But there remained one possibility she could not ignore. Someone had meant the pearls for another entirely, and if that were true, then Lady Fairfax's death may not have been the intended result at all. That evening brought a slow, uneasy rain, soft enough to mist the windows of the vicarage and blur the lamps along the lane. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting idle, the firelight catching faint glints of silver in her hair. She was thinking not about death, for she was long familiar with that subject, but about motive, that fragile thread that ties all human folly together. Lady Fairfax had not been loved by all. Respected, certainly. Feared, perhaps. The village owed her a sort of brittle gratitude for the fates, the donations, the occasional acts of charity, yet her sharp tongue and sharper pride had left behind small injuries in many hearts. And small injuries, Miss Marple knew, could fester into dangerous grudges. The sound of wheels on wet gravel drew her attention. Inspector Mallory was at the door, his coat glistening with rain. He looked more weary than before, carrying the solemn air of a man surrounded by too many half-truths. Mrs. Weatherby brought him in, fluttering about with offers of tea, but he waved them aside politely. "I've just come from Fairfax Hall," he said gravely. "There's been a development. The butler, Simmons, found something behind the writing desk in Lady Fairfax's study, a small bottle labelled rat poison, arsenic, according to Dr. Craythorne. But here's the odd thing. The bottle's dusty, clearly untouched for months. It doesn't fit with the thallium." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A planted clue, perhaps?" Mallory sighed. "That's my suspicion. And it was placed where it would be found, not hidden. Someone wants us looking in the wrong direction." "That," Miss Marple murmured, "usually means the truth lies very close indeed." Mallory glanced toward the fire. "The laboratory confirms your observation. The poison was applied directly to the pearls, not mixed with polish or handled carelessly. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. They must have worn gloves." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she resumed her work. "Gloves, yes. Or perhaps someone who had reason to avoid fingerprints altogether, a person too cautious, too deliberate." Mallory frowned. "You're thinking of someone specific?" "Oh, not yet," she said mildly. "But I find myself wondering who most feared those pearls. Not desired them, Inspector, but feared what they represented." He looked puzzled. "Feared them?" "Yes, for the pearls were not merely jewelry, you see. They were inheritance, power, pride, all the things that draw envy, like flies to honey." The inspector left soon after, leaving Miss Marple with her thoughts and the rhythmic patter of rain outside. When he was gone, she laid aside her knitting and took up a small notebook. Her handwriting, neat and spare, listed only names. Iris Pembroke, Bessie Holt, Lionel Greaves, Dr. Craythorne, Colonel Lacey. Next to each, she had made a single mark, not to measure guilt, but to weigh possibility. The next morning, when the rain cleared, Miss Marple walked to the village green, where Bessie was hanging linen on a line strung between two apple trees. The girl started when she saw her, eyes darting nervously. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a fright." "My apologies, dear. You mustn't be startled by old ladies, it makes us feel quite wicked." She smiled kindly, watching the girl's trembling hands. "You must have had a dreadful time at Fairfax Hall. All that commotion." Bessie nodded quickly. "I haven't slept proper since. The police keep asking questions. I swear I didn't do anything wrong." "I'm sure you didn't," said Miss Marple. "Still, I wonder when you poured the champagne. Did Lady Fairfax seem uneasy?" Bessie hesitated. "She said something strange just before it happened. Something about not being outdone. But I didn't understand what she meant." Miss Marple's expression softened. "No, my dear, I rather think she wasn't speaking to you at all." She left Bessie standing there, puzzled and pale, while a curious certainty settled over her mind. Lady Fairfax's death was not an act of simple malice, it was the end of a rivalry. Someone close, someone wounded long before that luncheon, had finally decided to even the scales. That afternoon, the air in Mildred seemed to hum with subdued tension. Though the rain had passed, clouds hung low and restless above the thatched rooftops. In the quiet rhythm of village life, something had shifted. Doors closed more quickly. Voices lowered mid-sentence, and each passerby seemed to glance over their shoulder as though guilt itself walked the lane. Miss Marple, however, moved serenely through it all, her calm expression belying the storm of reasoning that was now forming clear lines in her mind. The words of the maid, Bessie, not being outdone, lingered like an echo she could not ignore. Pride and rivalry, those two, she thought, are often more lethal than hatred. By evening, Inspector Mallory arrived once again, this time in a more agitated state. He paced before the vicarage hearth as Miss Marple listened, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've been speaking to Lionel Greaves," Mallory said sharply. "He claims Lady Fairfax had promised him an investment money to start a business venture, but she withdrew it a week before her death. He's angry, yes, but he swears he left early from the luncheon. We confirmed that with 2 witnesses." "Anger," Miss Marple said softly, "is a powerful motive, Inspector, but seldom the cleverest one. And this murder required cleverness, not temper." Mallory rubbed his brow. "The real trouble is the poison. Thallium isn't something you pick up at a corner shop. We've checked the chemists in 3 counties. Only one recent purchase matches the quantity, ordered under a false name." "And who," Miss Marple asked, "collected it?" "A man," Mallory replied grimly. "Dr. Craythorne's assistant said it was for rat control at the rectory under his authorization, but Craythorne insists he never ordered it." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-loop. "Oh dear," she murmured, "that is very revealing indeed." She said no more, and Mallory, accustomed by now to her silences, knew better than to press. When he left, the old lady sat long after, staring into the fire, her mind arranging details like threads in a tapestry. Lady Fairfax's pride, Dr. Craythorne's unexpected link to the poison, Iris's trembling guilt, and that curious phrase of defiance, before death not being outdone. The following morning, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, where she found the Reverend Weatherby tidying fallen blossoms from the memorial path. "A tragic business, Miss Marple," he sighed. "The inspector tells me the funeral must wait until the inquest. Poor Lady Fairfax. Such a commanding woman. She once told me she could never forgive betrayal." "Betrayal," Miss Marple repeated gently, stooping to straighten a flower. "Such a hard word, Reverend. And yet, it is often born of hurt rather than evil." Her visit to Fairfax Hall later that day was deliberate. She found Iris alone in the morning room, surrounded by unsorted correspondence. The girl's eyes were rimmed with fatigue. "I can't seem to make myself leave this place," she confessed. "Every time I think I should go." I imagine her voice again. Sharp, commanding, impossible to please. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "It must have been difficult, my dear, working for someone whose approval was rarely given." "It was," Iris admitted, her voice breaking. "But she wasn't always cruel. Sometimes she'd talk about her past, the family jewels, her late husband, her travels. She said the pearls were her victory, proof that she'd triumphed over everyone who'd ever doubted her." "And you believed her?" "I don't know," Iris whispered. "She lied about so many things, even the pearls. She used to say they were pure, flawless. But I remember once, when I was polishing them, one bead had a faint line across it, a flaw she told me to hide from guests." Miss Marple smiled faintly, a spark of understanding in her eyes. "A flaw, you say? How very interesting." When she left Fairfax Hall, the evening sun broke briefly through the clouds, setting the damp fields aglow. Miss Marple paused at the gate, watching the light fade again. The flaw, she thought, was not merely in the pearls, it was in the pride surrounding them. And pride, once threatened, had driven someone to ensure Lady Fairfax could never outdo anyone again. The truth was drawing nearer, and she could almost see its shape. That night, Mildred's lay hushed under a thin veil of fog, the kind that seemed to muffle every sound and make the village appear suspended between waking and dream. Miss Marple sat by the window of her guest room at the vicarage, the lamplight soft against her face, her thoughts turning over the conversation with Iris like pieces of a delicate puzzle. A flaw in the pearls, not merely a physical imperfection, but a symbolic one. Vanity had masked deceit, and deceit, she knew, had a habit of surfacing at the most inconvenient moments. She wondered how long Lady Fairfax had known that her victory over others rested upon something less than perfect. Perhaps she never knew at all. The following morning brought fresh commotion. Inspector Mallory arrived with a grim expression and a folded note in his hand. "You'll want to hear this, Miss Marple. Dr. Craythorne's been found unconscious in his study. Empty glass beside him. He's alive, but only just." "An attempted suicide?" she asked quietly. Mallory nodded. "Appears that way. There was a letter on his desk, half finished. He wrote that he couldn't bear the guilt. But guilt for what? We don't know." Miss Marple rose at once, her expression unchanged, though her mind leapt forward. "Then we must go to him, Inspector. There is guilt, yes, but I doubt it's the kind he meant to confess to." They found Dr. Craythorne pale and trembling in his bed, a faint smell of laudanum hanging in the air. His eyes fluttered open as Miss Marple entered. "I didn't mean," he murmured weakly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." "Lady Fairfax's death?" Miss Marple asked gently. He nodded faintly, a tear sliding down his cheek. "She was supposed to suffer, not die. A warning. Just a warning." Mallory leaned forward sharply. "You admit to poisoning her?" No, not me." His breath came raggedly. "I told Iris about the thallium. Years ago, in a foolish conversation. She said she was fascinated by rare toxins, asked how small a dose could harm. I thought it idle curiosity. Then the bottle vanished from my surgery a fortnight ago. I never imagined." His voice broke. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You imagined too late, Doctor, and yet I think you are still protecting someone." Craythorne turned away, whispering, "You wouldn't understand. She loved her, even when she hated her." The words settled in Miss Marple's mind with the clarity of truth. She rose quietly, thanked the doctor, and left the room. Outside, she met Mallory's troubled gaze. "Iris again," he muttered. "It always comes back to her, but she doesn't strike me as the sort to kill." "No," Miss Marple said slowly. She strikes one, as the sort who could be persuaded to for someone else's sake. Mallory frowned. Someone else? Miss Marple walked toward the gate, her pace deliberate. Someone who understood her loneliness, her need to please, her desperation to be valued after years of belittlement. Someone who made her believe she was righting a wrong. They followed that thread to the village inn, where Lionel Greaves was staying under polite police observation. He greeted them with forced civility, though unease glimmered beneath his charm. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "Mr. Greaves," she said, "did you know that Lady Fairfax had discovered your letters to Iris?" His composure faltered. "That's absurd. There were no letters." "Indeed, there were." She showed one to the vicar's wife, a rather tender note about her eyes and her courage. "You had much to lose if Lady Fairfax dismissed her, didn't you? Iris was your path back into fortune." Greaves's hand clenched at his side. "You've no proof." "Not yet," Miss Marple said calmly. "But Lady Fairfax's pearls had a flaw one only Iris would recognize, and I think you persuaded her to exploit that flaw, to dust them with poison, believing it would merely sicken her employer. When Lady Fairfax died instead, you panicked. You used the doctor's stolen thallium to stage a misdirection." He said nothing, but the flicker of fear in his eyes was answer enough. Mallory's voice was firm behind her. "Mr. Greaves, you'll come with me." As the inspector led him away, Miss Marple remained at the threshold, gazing toward the mist rolling once more over the green. She felt no triumph, only the familiar sorrow that accompanied all human folly. For love and pride, she thought, had conspired again to make a fool of reason, and death, as always, had claimed the final word. The next morning broke cold and clear, the fog having retreated to reveal a pale, washed sky over Mildred's. Yet even with Lionel Greaves under arrest, the air in the village remained uneasy, as though truth itself still hovered just out of reach. Inspector Mallory seemed content enough with the confession extracted from Greaves overnight, a reluctant admission that he had encouraged Iris to play a part in the poisoning, though he insisted he never intended murder. To most, that seemed conclusive. To Miss Marple, it did not. There was a note of something rehearsed in his words, a neatness that real guilt rarely possesses. And Iris, poor frightened Iris, had vanished before dawn, leaving behind a hastily written note of her own. "I can't bear it. Forgive me." Miss Marple stood at the vicarage window, the letter unfolded in her hands, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "It's too convenient," she murmured. "The guilty rarely make things so tidy. When people flee, Inspector, it's not always from justice. Sometimes it's from terror." Mallory frowned, pacing before the fire. "She's gone missing, that's certain. Her trunk's still at Fairfax Hall, but she took her coat and handbag. The station master says no one boarded the morning train. If she's hiding, she can't be far." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "She won't go far. No. Fear makes people run in circles, back toward what they know. I'd begin near the Fairfax property. There are sheds, a gardener's cottage, perhaps the old conservatory." They went together, accompanied by the pale morning light filtering through damp hedges. Fairfax Hall loomed ahead, its windows shuttered and lifeless, the echo of its late mistress lingering in the silence. The grounds were still wet with dew, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint impression of footprints leading toward the back gardens, smaller, lighter steps beside heavier ones that had long since dried. She followed them to the disused conservatory, its glass roof streaked with grime, ivy curling over the walls. The door was unlatched. Inside, beneath the scent of earth and decay, Iris sat upon a wooden bench, her face blotched with tears. At the sight of them, she started up, clutching her hands to her chest. "I didn't mean for her to die," she cried. "He said it would only make her ill, that it would teach her a lesson. I swear I didn't mean it." Mallory's tone was firm but not unkind. "You should have come to us, Miss Pembroke. Running only makes it worse." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice calm, almost maternal. My dear, you've been frightened for so long you can no longer tell guilt from fear. Tell me, why did you really do it? Iris's sobs quieted into trembling silence. Because she knew, she whispered. She knew Lionel and I were seeing each other. She said she'd ruin him, expose everything. But it wasn't Lionel who told me about the thallium, it was Dr. Craythorne. He said Lady Fairfax had been cruel to him too. He gave me the idea, told me how to use it safely. I didn't know he'd stolen it. Mallory's eyes widened. Craythorne. But he confessed to helping her out of guilt. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector. He confessed out of pity. Pity for the wrong person. He blamed himself to shield her, perhaps out of remorse, or something gentler. You see, Dr. Craythorne loved Iris Pembroke, quietly and hopelessly. He must have realized what she'd done too late and tried to take the burden upon himself. Iris stared at her, stunned. He loved me? Miss Marple smiled faintly, the expression tinged with melancholy. In his own quiet way, yes. But love, my dear, when mixed with shame, can drive people to the most tragic acts. Mallory exhaled slowly, the weight of the truth settling over them like the morning mist. Iris sank to her knees, the enormity of her choices pressing down at last. Miss Marple turned away, her gaze drifting through the broken panes toward the brightening sky. Another story of pride and pain, of affection twisted into ruin, the oldest pattern of all. And in that silence, the detective's gentle voice broke softly, almost as if speaking to herself. People seldom mean to kill, Inspector, but they do because they never learn that poison begins in the heart long before it ever reaches the hand. The confession in the conservatory should have ended the matter, but for Miss Marple, it only deepened the unease that had been stirring quietly beneath her calm exterior. The story, as it now stood, fitted too neatly. Human behavior, she often said, was rarely so well ordered. It left behind ragged edges, contradictions, unfinished thoughts, and this tidy resolution, with its clear lines of guilt and remorse, had none. When Inspector Mallory escorted Iris Pembroke away for her statement, Miss Marple lingered by the doorway, gazing at the abandoned pots and withered plants. Something about the scene whispered of deceit still thriving, like a weed growing beneath the surface. Later that evening, she sat in the vicarage parlour, a small fire burning low while the church bells tolled softly in the distance. Mrs. Weatherby fussed about with the teapot, convinced that poor Miss Marple must be exhausted after such dreadful excitement. But exhaustion was not what kept the old lady's mind alert. She was tracing patterns again, Dr. Craythorne's trembling words, Lionel's premature confession, and Iris's account that seemed both truthful and incomplete. What was missing, she wondered, was motive's deeper root, not the cause of death, but the cause of deceit. Inspector Mallory called in just before supper, his face drawn from long hours at the station. "We've confirmed Miss Pembroke's statement," he said. "The handwriting on the bottle label matches Dr. Craythorne's notes. It was his thallium. That ties everything together neatly enough." "Neatly, yes," Miss Marple replied, stirring her tea without drinking it, "but not truthfully, I think." Mallory looked exasperated. "Surely you're not suggesting another layer to this business? The case is closed in all but paperwork." She smiled faintly. "Ah, but paper, Inspector, is a poor substitute for conscience. Tell me, has anyone examined Lady Fairfax's will?" He blinked. "Her will? I don't see what—" "Oh, but it often explains what people dare not say aloud. I suspect you'll find a recent alteration. Lady Fairfax was not a woman to forgive betrayal, yet she also delighted in punishment more subtle than exposure." Mallory sighed but made a note to check. "You do keep us busy, Miss Marple." The next morning, the inspector returned with a document in hand and a strange look on his face. "You were right again," he said reluctantly. "The will was amended 3 days before her death. Iris Pembroke was to inherit £10,000, not a fortune, but generous. But there's more. The pearls, they weren't left to Iris or any relative. They were to be sold, and the proceeds given to Dr. Craythorne's medical fund for impoverished patients. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. Then the poison wasn't meant for Lady Fairfax at all. It was meant for whoever handled the pearls next, Dr. Craythorne himself. The act of vanity that killed her was meant to destroy his reputation afterward. She must have suspected something and decided to wear the pearls one final time, perhaps to prove her dominance even in deceit. Mallory stared. "You mean Lady Fairfax poisoned the pearls herself?" "I believe so," Miss Marple said softly. She would have discovered his theft of thallium, her housekeeper likely told her he'd visited. She was a woman who lived for control, for spectacle. What greater punishment than to die in a public scene that condemned her enemies by implication? Pride can be a very theatrical thing. The inspector sank into the nearest chair, astonishment overtaking irritation. "So all this time it was her doing?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. Her death was a performance, one final manipulation from a woman who could not bear to be defeated, not even by death itself. The room fell silent, except for the slow tick of the clock. Outside, the wind brushed against the windowpanes like the faint sigh of someone amused beyond the grave. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked into the fire. "In the end," she murmured, "the pearls were never poisoned by hatred, Inspector, only by pride. And pride, as I've often observed, is far deadlier than arsenic. Mildred's like a quiet storm, the sort that doesn't break with thunder but lingers, heavy and unresolved, in the air." Inspector Mallory spent the following day fielding inquiries from the coroner, the press, and a handful of curious villagers who seemed determined to believe a more ordinary tale than the one Miss Marple proposed. But within the vicarage, the truth hung sharp and undeniable. Lady Fairfax had orchestrated her own death not in despair, but in vengeance, crafting the ultimate gesture of power even as her life slipped away. It was an idea so cruel and so precise that it disturbed even Miss Marple, who had long accepted the darkness that hides beneath polite behavior. That afternoon, the inspector called again, looking unusually pensive. "The coroner's inquest confirms your theory, Miss Marple," he said, setting down his hat. "The level of thallium on the pearls couldn't have come from casual handling. It must have been applied directly, deliberately, by someone who knew she'd be the first to touch them. You've solved it. Though heaven help me, I wish you hadn't been right." Miss Marple smiled faintly but without satisfaction. "Evil dressed in fine manners often escapes notice until it's too late, Inspector. I dare say Lady Fairfax would have approved of your discomfort. She was a great admirer of cleverness when it served her own pride." Mallory rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We've released Greaves. There's no charge we can hold him on now, though I expect he'll vanish the moment the papers stop printing his name. Iris Pembroke will recover in time, though her conscience will trouble her longer than any prison sentence could." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "She'll learn that remorse, when sincere, is the only thing capable of redeeming folly. As for Dr. Craythorne, I trust he'll find a quieter kind of peace." The inspector hesitated, glancing at her curiously. "You don't think Lady Fairfax anticipated that, do you? That her death would destroy them all, not just punish one?" "Oh, she anticipated it very well," Miss Marple replied. "She was a strategist to the end. Vanity such as hers doesn't merely wish to win. It insists upon leaving a ruin as proof." That evening, the village began to settle again, though not entirely at ease. The talk in the shops drifted toward other matters, a new curate, the upcoming summer fete. But every now and then, someone mentioned Fairfax Hall in a lowered voice, as though the walls might still be listening. Miss Marple walked the lane at twilight, her grey shawl wrapped close about her shoulders. The manor stood dark against the last streaks of light, its windows reflecting the fading sun like blind eyes. She paused at the gate, her gaze tracing the outlines of the house she had come to understand more deeply than its late mistress ever did. Pride, envy, and loneliness, those were the ghosts that haunted it, not Lady Fairfax herself. The ivy stirred faintly in the evening wind, and she fancied it almost whispered a farewell. Later, Back at the vicarage, Mrs. Weatherby joined her by the hearth, a cup of tea in each hand. "Well, Jane," she sighed, "I can't make head nor tail of it all. To plan one's own death just to spite others, it's monstrous." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her eyes distant. "Monstrous, yes, but not incomprehensible. I've known many women like Lady Fairfax, all charm and elegance, but built upon fear. Fear of being forgotten, of being ordinary. For some, that fear becomes so large it devours love, friendship, and even decency." Mrs. Weatherby shivered. "And what happens to such people, do you think?" "Oh," Miss Marple said quietly, her tone tinged with sadness. "They leave the world convinced they've won and never realize they've already lost everything worth keeping." Outside, the last of the church bells faded into the dusk. The case of the poisoned pearls was officially closed, yet its shadow lingered in the hearts of those who had known Lady Fairfax. In the silence that followed, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, each soft click of the needles a quiet benediction over the frailties of human nature, an act of calm in a world where vanity had once worn a string of pearls and called it victory. The days that followed brought a strange quiet to Mildred's, as though the village itself was trying to forget. Yet forgetting, Miss Marple knew, was never quite so simple. Fairfax Hall stood empty now, its windows shuttered, the grand lawns slowly losing their symmetry to encroaching weeds. A solicitor from London had arrived to handle the estate. A stiff, humorless man who spoke in clipped tones and avoided eye contact with the villagers. Rumour had it the house would be sold before summer's end. The news was received with a curious mix of relief and regret. Relief that the shadow of scandal might finally lift. Regret that the old house, for all its darkness, had still been a part of their world. Miss Marple took her usual walk along the church path one mild afternoon, her parasol tapping softly against the stones. The spring flowers were beginning to bloom again, a quiet assertion of life's resilience. Yet even as she admired their colour, her thoughts drifted to Lady Fairfax. Some crimes, she mused, did not die with their perpetrators. They lingered, echoing in those who had stood too near. She thought of Iris Pembroke, who had left for Bath under Dr. Craythorne's care. It was said she was recovering, though she rarely spoke. And of Lionel Greaves, already gone abroad, chasing some new scheme, his name now a cautionary tale in the village. That evening, Inspector Mallory called one final time before returning to his station in Melchester. He found Miss Marple sitting in the vicarage garden, a shawl draped about her shoulders, her eyes serene as the dusk deepened. "You'll be pleased to know," he began. "The coroner's report has put the matter to rest, officially concluded as self-administered poisoning, deliberate, but not suicidal. A curious phrase, isn't it?" "Curious. Yes," Miss Marple agreed, smiling faintly. "Though quite accurate. Lady Fairfax never meant to die, she merely overestimated her control. It's a common failing among those who believe themselves cleverer than others." Mallory chuckled softly. "If I've learned anything from this case, it's that cleverness can be more dangerous than malice." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Malice burns hot and soon consumes itself. But cleverness, especially when coupled with pride, lingers long enough to destroy everything it touches." They sat in companionable silence for a time. The evening star flickered faintly over the horizon, and the faint hum of crickets filled the pauses between their thoughts. Mallory finally rose, brushing his hat against his sleeve. "You'll forgive me, Miss Marple, if I say I hope our paths don't cross again professionally." "I'd much prefer it be over tea," she smiled warmly. "I should like that very much, Inspector, though I suspect trouble will find me again long before you do." When he had gone, Miss Marple remained seated, listening to the fading sound of footsteps down the lane. There was a stillness about the world that only came after storms deceptive but tender. She folded her hands in her lap and reflected on the strange satisfaction she felt. Justice, in her eyes, was never about punishment. It was about truth, quiet, persistent truth that refused to be buried, no matter how deep pride might dig the grave. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the first truly warm day of spring. Mrs. Weatherby called through the window that the roses were in bud again, and Miss Marple, smiling, went out to see. The petals, soft and blushing, unfurled in the sunlight like shy confessions, and she thought how fitting it was that beauty should return to the village after so much bitterness. Fairfax Hall might one day crumble, its story reduced to gossip and legend, but the truth, the real truth, would remain, tucked safely in the memory of one quiet old lady who understood that human wickedness was not so much mysterious as it was familiar. She turned toward the church, where the bells began their slow, familiar toll, and as she walked, her figure small against the bright horizon, the village of Mildred seemed, at last, to breathe again unaware, perhaps that the gentlest woman among them had once more seen into the heart of darkness and found her way out with grace. Several weeks passed, and the rhythms of Mildred slowly began to mend themselves, as if the tragedy at Fairfax Hall was something whispered about in another lifetime. The spring air grew warmer. The churchyard filled with daisies, and the market square hummed again with the small gossip of daily life, the sort that concerned jam competitions and parish notices rather than poison and scandal. Yet, despite the seeming calm, Miss Marple sensed a faint current of unease still winding through the village. Some stories, she knew, never truly ended. They merely went quiet, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear what was left unsaid. One morning, a letter arrived addressed to her in a delicate, unfamiliar hand. The postmark read, Bath. She recognized it before opening Iris Pembroke's writing, neat, yet hesitant, as though afraid of what the page might reveal. The letter was brief, but it trembled with the confusion of a conscience not yet settled. Iris wrote that she had begun working as a secretary for a small household there, that she was trying to live rightly, and that she often dreamed of Lady Fairfax, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, but always wearing her pearls. She closed with a line that made Miss Marple pause. Do you ever think the dead can forgive us, if we did not mean the worst of it? Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her expression thoughtful. Forgiveness was a fragile thing, she mused, rarely granted by the living and seldom earned by the guilty. Still, she was relieved that Iris was seeking something beyond remorse. The search for understanding was always a step toward peace. That afternoon, she took her tea in the vicarage garden, and it was there that Inspector Mallory appeared once more, though quite by chance. He had come down from Melchester to attend a district meeting, and could not resist stopping by. You'll be amused to hear, he said as he joined her, that Fairfax Hall has been sold. Some London families bought it, the Branhams, I believe. He's a retired barrister. She's fond of charity committees and flower shows. Seems the old place will be lively again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, houses do like to be lived in. They forget their ghosts more easily that way. Mallory chuckled, but she noticed the crease between his brows. Something still troubles you, Inspector? He hesitated. Well, there was a curious note from the London solicitor handling the sale. Apparently, when they were clearing out the study, they found a sealed envelope hidden behind the false back of Lady Fairfax's writing desk. It was addressed to the coroner, but never sent. Miss Marple's knitting paused. How intriguing. And what did it contain? Her handwriting, Mallory said grimly. A confession of sorts. She wrote that if she were ever found dead under suspicious circumstances, the cause would be her own hand guided by another's cruelty. She named no names, but she did mention one person directly, Craythorne. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes deepened with quiet comprehension. Then she knew, she said softly. She knew about his feelings and perhaps she used them. Mallory nodded. That's my thought. Maybe she taunted him, or manipulated his loyalty. She was a master at that sort of thing. But the strangest part, she wrote, that she intended to teach them all humility. It's as if she planned the entire thing not for revenge, but for spectacle. She wanted her death to be instructional. Miss Marple's lips tightened, not in disapproval, but in something close to pity. Yes, vanity's final sermon. There are people, Inspector, who live their whole lives performing for an audience, even if the curtain falls upon themselves. Lady Fairfax was one of those. He sighed. The coroner will likely archive the letter. No use reopening the case now, but it does rather chill the blood, doesn't it? It should, Miss Marple replied gently. But perhaps it should also remind us that evil doesn't always appear in the expected shapes. Sometimes it comes dressed in lace and manners, with a teacup in hand and perfect posture. They spoke a while longer of smaller things, the vicar's new sermon, the coming fate, the curious resilience of village gossip before Mallory took his leave. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in silence, the garden's hum around her, the faint perfume of roses in the air. She thought again of the letter from Iris and the one from Lady Fairfax, so different in tone yet bound by the same thread of guilt and pride. Both women had sought absolution in their own way, one through regret, the other through control. And perhaps, she thought, that was the truest tragedy, that people so seldom understood the harm they did until it was far too late to undo it. That evening, as twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard. The fresh grass had already begun to cover Lady Fairfax's grave, and someone, perhaps Mrs. Weatherby, had placed a small vase of lilies beside the stone. The inscription was simple: Constance Fairfax, beloved patroness and friend. Miss Marple regarded it for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Not beloved, perhaps, she murmured softly, but remembered. And that, my dear lady, was always what you wanted most. She lingered until the bells chimed the hour, then turned for home. The stars were beginning to prick through the indigo sky, bright and patient. As she walked, her steps light and even, she reflected on the curious patterns of life, how pride could masquerade as strength, how weakness could wear the face of kindness, and how even the smallest deception, left unchecked, could grow into tragedy. The village was still, the night kind, and Miss Marple felt, as she often did after such cases, a deep and quiet acceptance. Human nature would never change. It would always err, always falter, always surprise, and she, for as long as she drew breath, would continue to watch, to listen, and to understand. And somewhere beyond the silence of the hedgerows, an owl called a long, low note that faded into the distance, as if to close the tale of the poisoned pearls, with a sound older than judgment and softer than forgiveness. The season tipped quietly into early summer, and Mildred's put on its best face again. Roses climbed obediently over cottage lintels, bees stitched gold along the hedgerows, and even the wind, lately the gossip of so many tragedies, moved like a careful maid straightening the covers after a restless night. Miss Marple found herself walking further each morning, her feet carrying her by long habit past the church, the green, the narrow lane that curved beneath a sycamore and ran out toward Fairfax Hall. She would have said she had no particular destination, and yet she always stopped at the same stile, where she could just see the upper windows of the great house through a scrim of elm. From that vantage the manor looked chastened rather than proud, its chimneys square against the sky, as if the house itself had learned that grandeur, untempered, invites mischief. A letter from the London solicitor arrived in due course, neat and sensible. The estate was settled. The new owners, Mr. and Mrs. Branham, would take possession at the fortnight. The medical fund, named in Lady Fairfax's will, had been established, and the pearls, after due certification, were to be sold at auction in London. The proceeds to endow that fund permanently. There was also a smaller notice enclosed on a separate slip. If Miss Jane Marple, as a person of special understanding in the matter, wished to attend the sale, a seat would be reserved for her. The phrase made her smile. Special understanding. Indeed, that was a solicitor's way of saying that one had seen what others preferred not to. Mrs. Weatherby declared at once that Miss Marple must go for the symbolism, dear Jane, and because a train journey will do your lungs good. And so she did, with a modest overnight bag, a sensible grey hat, and a note left with the vicar's wife that said only, "Back tomorrow. Do keep the rose cuttings from drying." The London day was all glare and bustle. The auction rooms, cool and self-possessed, held a scatter of people whose expressions were uniformly polite and privately ravenous. Wealth, Miss Marple reflected, has its own hygiene. It seldom shows its appetite on the face. The pearls lay under glass for viewing beforehand, a small crescent moon against black velvet. They were handsome still, that was the surface of things. But surfaces are only ever introductions. Miss Marple waited her turn, then bent a fraction closer than anyone else, because old ladies are always permitted to do so. The flaw Iris had described, a fine hairline across one bead, was visible, though faint. There was also, she noted with a small stir of interest, an exceedingly slight nick near the clasp, as if a nervous hand had once fumbled the latch. That, she remembered, and had not been present when the pearls were first taken into evidence. She had noticed the clasp then, because it bore a tiny engraving, an F within a wreath. The nick was new. She straightened, thanked the attendant, and found a seat. The sale, when it reached the lot, moved briskly. The string rose by measured increments, the paddles bobbed, and at last the hammer fell for a handsome sum. The room breathed out. The moment dissolved into figures. Only then did Miss Marple request a word with the house expert, a man whose gentility had been ironed to the same crispness as his shirt. "I suppose," she said mildly, "you've tested them again since the unfortunate incident." "But of course, madam," he answered smoothly. "All chemical traces now absent. Thoroughly cleaned and safe. You may rely on our processes." "Oh, I do," she said. "I only wondered whether the clasp was replaced as part of that process. There's a nick one didn't see before." The man's expression did not falter, but his eyes flickered a professional's tell. The clasp was removed temporarily for cleaning the chain. It was replaced. Any minute variation is within tolerances. "Is it, indeed?" Miss Marple smiled like a harmless teapot and let the matter drop. People who feared being found out often confessed to themselves so loudly that one hardly needed to press. On the journey home, she considered not the nick itself, which might be innocent, but the impulse to answer her so quickly. Speed, she had learned, is sometimes the mask of uncertainty. The Branhams arrived the following week with a cheerful, practical air that made even the suspicious feel apologetic. Mr. Branham had the face of a man who had spent his life arguing difficult points of law and, having won enough of them, was now content to argue with roses instead. Mrs. Branham had a good laugh and a way of clasping one's hand that implied she meant to like you and would be disappointed if you proved otherwise. They invited the village up for lemonade on the lawn, an act of tact more than largesse, and as neighbors drifted across the gravel drives with cautious smiles, Fairfax Hall softened like a scolded child willing to try again. Miss Marple chatted with the new mistress beneath a striped awning. Mrs. Branham confessed, in a brief whisper, that she had been a little frightened of the place's reputation, but was determined to fill it with ordinary kindness. "I've been told," she said, "that houses remember what we do in them." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied, "but they forget it again, if you give them better things to remember." A week later, the London solicitor wrote once more, with an addendum as precise as a footnote. The auction house, upon a further internal audit, triggered by a complaint from the buyer, who had taken the pearls to his own jeweler, had discovered that the clasp had indeed been removed prior to the sale without full documentation. The string remained the original. The clasp was a near-perfect twin taken, most likely, from a repair stock. The buyer, annoyed but practical, accepted a small concession. The endowment to the medical fund would not be affected. The tone of the letter was embarrassed. Miss Marple allowed herself a very small, very private satisfaction. Vanity, on all scales, resists accuracy. It had been true of Lady Fairfax. It was true of auction rooms. The pattern, like a watermark, persisted. Dr. Craythorne called on Miss Marple shortly after with a bouquet of sweet peas and a manner both grateful and uncertain. "The fund has already made a difference," he said quietly. "I've a convalescent bed now for those who can't pay. It bears her name. I didn't know if that would trouble you." "Names don't trouble me, Doctor," Miss Marple said. "What we do under them does. Let the good outlast the bad. It often does, if given a decent push." He hesitated, his fingers tracing the lip of his hat. "I've had a letter from Iris from Bath. She says she is writing to you as well. She wishes to know if she is permitted to come home." "Home," Miss Marple repeated, and in her voice there was something almost tender. Such a complicated word. "Tell her she may return to Mildred's when she can look the morning in the face without fear. That will mean more than any timetable." That evening, the village gathered for the summer fete stalls under bunting, jam in glass suns, a modest raffle whose first prize was a hamper and whose second was a goose that refused to be raffled anywhere. Miss Marple took a turn at the tea tent, then wandered past the ring toss, where children shrieked with triumph and despair in equal measure. The church bells pealed as if in approval. It struck her, not for the first time, that peace is not the absence of wickedness, but the presence of balance. Each day's mischief and mercy weighed against each other like scales that never stopped trembling. On her way home, she detoured by the stile. The sun had slipped, leaving a domino of shadows, and Fairfax Hall lay thoughtful in the late light. She imagined, for an instant, Lady Fairfax upon the terrace, the cut of her chin, the careful tilt of her shoulders, and then the image dissolved, and Mrs. Branham stepped out, laughing with a footman about some domestic oversight, a clumsy vase or a too bold cushion. The house changed posture, almost visibly, as if exhaling. Houses are not alive, Miss Marple knew, but they do collect the habits of those who use them. The way linen collects scent. It would be a different scent now. When she reached the vicarage, a note awaited her, forwarded from Bath. Iris's hand again, steadier this time. "I think I understand now that forgiveness is a task, not a moment. I am not ready to return. But I am writing to the fund every month with what I can spare. Perhaps one day I will sit in the garden and not see her everywhere." The letter was signed with a simple iris and a postscript. "Please thank Dr. Craythorne for the flowers. They made the room seem kind." Miss Marple placed the letter in a small drawer where she kept the odd tokens of her cases. A tram ticket with a torn corner, a bakery receipt with a false name. Once a ribbon faded to the color of remembered bruises. Not trophies, never that. They were reminders, like pins on a map. Here is where pride broke. Here is where kindness mended. Here is where someone stood at the edge and came back. Toward midnight, with the village settled and the sky strewn in salt-bright stars, she sat by her window, the room dark except for a pool of lamplight around her knitting. She thought of the pearls, now circling some new neck far from Mildred's, of the clasp that had pretended to be itself and failed at the last question, eyes of Lady Fairfax's letter to the coroner, and the peculiar itch of those who must control the moral of their own story. People are very odd, she thought, but very legible. If one is patient. She laid the knitting aside and closed the lamp. In the hush that followed, she heard only the small noises of a house at rest, a pipe settling, the faint tick of the hall clock. It was a comfortable sound, unambitious. Tomorrow would be ordinary again. A visit to Mrs. Finch for currants. A word with the verger about the hymn numbers. A look in on the Branhams' new gardener, who had a tendency to prune as if every shrub had offended him personally. Life. That was the point of all this investigating, if there was a point at all. Not the catching, not the cleverness, not even the justice, though each had its place, but the returning to life afterward and finding it still, miraculously, itself. She slept then, and Mildred slept with her. And somewhere beyond the hedges a fox trotted under a hedge, with the silent importance of a creature that has never read a newspaper and intends to keep it that way. In the morning, the post would come with more small things, and Miss Marple would open them one by one, and the world would go on with its quiet mixture of tea and tragedy, pettiness and grace. And if, from time to time, a memory of white orbs on black velvet drifted up, she would let it pass like a cloud across a steadfast sun, a lesson concluded, a vanity archived, and a house learning, at last, the manners of gentler lives.